This account of authenticity, I shall, for the sake of convenience, call it the phenomenological account, differs from what I shall, again for the sake of convenience, call the existential account. And understanding the difference can help to clarify it, I think. The existential account connects authenticity to human freedom. The authentic human agent is the agent that makes of herself who and what she is through her choices. The phenomenological account, on the other hand, connects authenticity to truthfulness, to having the proper sense of things. I do not, of course, mean to deny freedom in matters of cognition, feeling, or acting. Our judgments are not caused by the things whose proper sense we seek, but they are normed by those things, by what the things truly are, and, as we have seen, by what we are. Second, therefore, whereas authenticity on the existential view is tied to a notion of self-definition through self-conscious choice, authenticity on the phenomenological view is tied to a notion of self-realization insofar as I realize myself as a truthful and responsible agent. I come to have truthful convictions about things precisely because I have achieved self-responsible, justified judgments about those things, and I am the subject of those convictions. On this view, authenticity cannot have the same content neutrality that authenticity on the existential view does, or at least seems to have. Third, authenticity on the existential view appears in the guise of a virtue, a disposition to choose in certain ways. In exercising its freedom, a human being makes one's projects one's own, and authenticity names the disposition to take control over one's life in self-conscious choices so as to free oneself from the alienating social and historical forces that threaten to make one a pawn of circumstance. Authenticity, then, is precisely the disposition to choose and execute projects as one's own. On the phenomenological view, on the other hand, authenticity or self-responsibility is, as we have seen, an end, not the manner of rational agency. Thinking truly, feeling appropriately, and acting rightly are goods properly realized only in intersubjective contexts when others also realize them. The apprehension of moral goods, decisions about how best to realize those goods, and evaluative judgments about our own actions, the actions of others, and social practices and institutions all arise against the background of a common knowledge embodied in our collective determination of moral concepts, of choice-worthy goods, and of praiseworthy actions. This common knowledge, our notion of rudeness, for example, or kindness or honesty, is passed from one generation to the next by means of the stories we tell young people, the songs we sing, the practices we adopt, the laws we write, the institutions we establish, and even the games we play. Whenever I make this point in America, I then go into waxing eloquently about baseball. It never works in Europe. Moreover, it continues to be worked out. This common knowledge continues to be worked out, criticized, reappropriated, and modified within successive generations in our encounters with one another, with those whose opinions or reasoning might differ from our own. Only in coming to grips with differing opinions and beliefs can we truly be said to come to know ourselves as a person holding certain convictions that have withstood a certain kind of testing. In other words, one does not and cannot reason well by oneself. In order to be self-responsible and to realize the goods of agency, one must think for oneself. But since one cannot rightly think by oneself, these goods of agency must be effectively, even if only implicitly, chosen for others as well as for oneself. Insofar as the goods of agency are realized in an agent's making moral sense of the world as she straightforwardly and virtuously pursues what is good for herself and others, we might also think of these goods of agency as second-order goods that are both inherent constituents of or necessary conditions for virtuously pursuing first-order goods for oneself and others, and B, superveniently realized in those virtuous pursuits. An example of an inherent constituent of the good of the self-responsible life would be the personal autonomy of both myself and the other. Since the good of the self-responsible life is realizable only in an intersubjective community, these inherent constituents often take political form, as constitutionally embodied in the freedoms of thought, speech, and association, for example. An inherent constituent of the self-responsible life is, in general, something apart from which the life of free, rational, and insightful agency remains unrealized. A necessary condition of this life, on the other hand, is a first-order good required for the exercise of the capacity for self-responsibility. Some of these conditions are primarily bodily, for example, the health, sustenance, and shelter for maintaining life as well as bodily security. And there's all sorts of evidence, for example, that those who suffer from severe hunger, their minds just kind of shut down because it takes too much energy, and it's energy they can't afford to use. All their energy is devoted simply to staying alive. These kinds of necessary conditional goods, these too can take political form, as in protections against assault and coercion, or in refashioning our conception of distributive justice in a doctrine of social and economic rights. Other conditions are not primarily bodily. For example, and most importantly, education, with its concern for both theoretical and practical wisdom. The education, in other words, of the mind, the emotions, and of choice. These goods obligate us insofar as we recognize the necessary desirability of the constituent goods, without which no one would be a free, insightful agent at all, and of those conditional goods, without which one could be a free, insightful agent only with great and perhaps insuperable difficulty. Consequently, there is a class of goods, the goods of agency, organized around the notion of thinking, feeling, and willing correctly, as well as a set of behaviors, practices, and virtues ordered to the realization of these goods that are necessarily, albeit implicitly, chosen by the virtuous agent insofar as that agent pursues any goods at all. Securing the goods of agency for ourselves and others does not foreclose the pursuit of different first-order goods. The universality of the goods of agency is, in other words, consistent with what we might call the democracy or pluralism of goods pursuable in free societies. However, insofar as the responsible pursuit of first-order goods requires that one secure the goods of agency as such, the pursuit of at least some first-order goods, or apparent goods, is morally wrong on universalistic grounds if that pursuit blocks the realization of the goods of agency either for ourselves or for another. But within that limitation, there are many choice-worthy first-order goods. The first-order goods for agents and patients are now apprehended both as necessarily transformed by and as yielding to the second-order goods of agency. For example, in exercising honesty and kindness toward a friend who is about to make a seriously flawed decision that might cost her her job, one might be honestly abrupt with her in order, as it were, to save her from herself. But one might in this circumstance offer advice in such a bullying way that one's friend begins to feel coerced in her decision. The effect of one's bullying honesty, no less honest because bullying, would be to limit the friend's autonomy to decide for herself about the best course of action, and thereby close off the possibility for her realization of self-responsibility. This would be to place both the good for the agent, one's own honesty, and the good for the other, the friend's keeping her job, first-order good for the other, the friend's keeping her job, ahead of the other's good of agency, that is to say, autonomy, authentically or self-responsibly deciding for herself. Recognizing the necessity, therefore, of the goods of agency for the pursuit of first-order goods, one's sense of honesty is refined to the point that one recognizes that honesty with a friend cannot truly be thought of in such a way that it would permit denying one's friend the autonomy to make up her own mind and to choose for herself. Understood in the context of the goods of agency, genuinely brutal honesty is honesty in name only. Similarly, in the case of rudeness mentioned earlier, the shouting is seen not merely as violating what achieves the ends of conversation, but as also intimidating and belittling the employee. The shouting is deemed wrong both because it fails to conduce to the ends of conversation and because it fails to respect the employee, who as a fellow moral subject and along with me and others discloses the moral sense of our shared world. We can now remove the provisional but not tentative nature of our characterization of self-responsible volition. We can now say, and this is 6 on your handout, V is rationally justified and A is right if and only if A, E is appropriate, B, E rationally motivates the desire for G, C, the desire for G rationally motivates V, the volition, D, A conduces to G as an internal or external consequence, and here's what's added, E, A does not frustrate or frustrates least. You might want to talk about that qualification and discussion, perhaps. A does not frustrate or frustrates least the realization of necessarily valued second-order goods of agency. And F, no relation of justification entailed, is defeated. So the rational connection of the evaluating feeling or emotion to the volition in 6B and C, the realization of the end of action in its performance, 6D, and ensuring that the action also conduces to necessarily willed goods, in 6E, justify the correctness of the volition and the rightness of the action. Phenomenological descriptions reveal important truths about essential features of the transcendental dimension of the human. In this respect, this phenomenological and Aristotelic approach goes beyond both Aristotelian naturalism and contemporary naturalism to acknowledge the transcendental dimension of the human as an agent that makes moral sense of the world and whose making sense is teleologically ordered toward truth in its cognitive, axiological, and practical guises. Moreover, the appeal to the second-order goods of agency grounds both Aristotle's claim that some actions are always and inherently wrong, and Kant's claim that we should not make an exception in our own case. I mentioned at the outset that the eudaimonistic reading of self-responsibility enables phenomenology to engage a number of contemporary debates. I want to suggest in concluding then that this phenomenological approach yields a view compatible with neo-Aristotelian approaches at both the meta-ethical and normative levels. First, we see repeated in this axiological approach the Aristotelian meta-ethical views that the emotions have cognitive content, that they pick out what is morally salient in a situation, and that the moral agent develops habits of thinking, feeling, and acting, that is, dispositions to have the right beliefs and attitudes and to act rightly. Second, the axiology sketched here affirms the Aristotelian normative view that there is a teleology, a eudaimonia or flourishing proper to reason, the teleology of thinking truly, feeling appropriately, and acting rightly, and at the same time honors the Kantian claim that we must respect the autonomy of all other rational agents, for it is only in the exercise of that autonomy that they can be self-responsible. Third, this view focuses our fundamental moral judgment on the self-responsibility of the agent in determining for herself the truth of her beliefs, the appropriateness of her attitudes, the correctness of her deliberations, and the rightness of her actions. The fundamental normative judgment pertains to the character of agents rather than the rightness or wrongness of a particular action. And it is in relation to this overriding good of rational agency that we must think about the virtues appropriate for the flourishing human life. This phenomenological approach, in other words, can both position itself among contemporary neo-Aristotelian contenders and engage both deontological and utilitarian viewpoints in meaningful debate. Thank you.